Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in bountiful Bakersfield, California. This is the Sixth Sense Society. I'm your host, Krista, here with our producer, Michael, and today you're tuning in to Spell It Out, Magic, Reflections, and Shadows, where I take a topic and run with it. So today I'm going back to my roots when I first started exploring witchcraft, and I'm going to be talking about the very influential book, Aradia, Gospel of the Witches by Charles Leland. And I'm going to just talk about the book itself and some of the ideas that come from it. But before we get started, Michael has a few announcements.
Everybody, welcome back to the show. We have a special time and guest next week. It's actually not even next week. Is Chauncey Felix, who is the artist and author of the Everdore series of novels. And we're excited to have her here in person since she's local here to Bakersfield. But because of her scheduling requirements, the episode will be on live on Saturday, the 15th at 1 p.m., our usual time. So please, special date and time. So check in on that Saturday, the 15th. You can get all the information on the upcoming shows on our website, sixthsensesociety.com, SAXTH, all spelled out. While you're there, buy us a coffee on Ko-Fi. Helps us cover a bit of our costs. And don't forget, our new book, Tarot Alchemy, A Kabbalah-Inspired Approach to Reading the Cards, is now available on Amazon, so you guys can look for that as well. Please search under books or you'll never find it. And, most importantly, tell people to like and subscribe and help us grow our show. And we love our audience. And please, don't be shy about chatting and sharing your comments or questions during the broadcast. And we're happy to try and answer as many as we can. So I don't want to take up any more time because we're a short episode today. So take it away, Krista.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And I forgot to say happy Women's History Month. And so actually, I think the topic really goes along with Women's History Month. Certainly has, even though it's written by a man, it features primarily female important deities in the book itself. So my reason for the show, as I was I want to go back to my roots lately, and I was thinking about when I first formally left Tibetan Buddhism, which I had been, a pretty serious practitioner, and it's a very formal, structured path, which is fine. And I was a little unhappy with, at the time, some of the things in Tibetan Buddhism that did not agree with me. And one was the way the animal world is perceived. Have always been a fan of nature, even when I was a little girl. And then there was a woman, Annie Wongmo, and she was a woman who had done a 10-year solitary retreat. And she came out. I did meet her, and she was just fabulous. And not at all what you kind of would expect. She was a true yogini. And I remember that she really wasn't put on any kind of a platform for us to ask her questions. And I was a little bothered by that as a woman. I was like, well, what? Well, she's just did a 10-year solitary retreat. Why are we not like listening to teachings from her? So there was a lot of sort of reasons. And I think I just wanted to be a free spirit. So I didn't sort of leave in a negative way. I just decided I wanted to do my own thing. And I started exploring first the goddess tradition. And it kind of led me naturally to witchcraft. And in fact, I had forgotten one of the first goddesses I worked with was actually Diana. I was very drawn to Diana because she was the huntress connected to animals and her strong connection to the moon. And I would definitely say that it was lunar magic I was really drawn to initially. But again, I would do my own thing. And this is before I met Michael. I decided simply to sort of go and gaze at the moon sometimes. I had my own, since I was a poet or am a poet, I memorized a good part of Doreen Valenti's amazing Charge of the Goddess. And I would just read that out loud in the morning as my ritual. And it was a very, I would say, very simple form of connecting to witchcraft. But what really drew me to witchcraft was this connection to nature and the fact that it wasn't hierarchical. And of course, that women play a central role in most religions currently, even though you can see that they have had influential roles, women are not the dominant creator. And so in witchcraft, and certainly forms of witchcraft, she can be the only creator. And I think I needed that balance in my life. So anyway, it was the 90s, 1990s, and I'm pretty sure somebody recommended Aradia, Gospel of the Witches to me by Charles Leland. And it's been a long time since I've read it, so I reread it, and I found it to be so fascinating and interesting. And you can see, I can see especially now, the market made on witchcraft, and it really has and continues to make a mark on the modern revival of witchcraft in many ways. And Charles Leland himself published this book in 1890, and it's said to be about Italian witchcraft. And we're going to go into sort of more of the details of the book too. But it's just an interesting read. I think it's just one of those things that one ought to read because you can see the influence, and it's just really quirky and touching and also surprising. There's some things in it that I'd totally forgotten about. So let me talk a little bit about the book itself. So first of all, I wanted to mention mostly on this show the actual book, and I wanted to mention in passing that there are some newer translations. So which is really cool. And when I was first introduced, there was no other translation. And so, from what I can tell, the first major retranslation of Aradia was in 1999 by Dr. Mario and Dina Pazzoglini. And you can still get that book. And along with the book, I haven't had the opportunity to read that one yet, but I plan to. There's also a lot of essays from different people. So it's really gets a lot of good feedback, and I would certainly recommend it. And he spent a long time, and I think that was his mother, Dina, working on this translation. And then the next one, which is I happen to have, I bought it. I'd forgotten I bought Aradia Retold by Patricia Della Piana, and she published hers in 2009. And also, I think her premise was to do a really good translation. She's not trying to argue whether or not this is a legitimate book. And then the last person I have found so far that has done something either with retranslating and also finding some more verses is Craig Spencer in 2020 published Aradia, A Modern Guide to Charles Godfrey Leland's Gospel of the Witches, and he's planning on putting out an expanded edition this year in November on this. And basically, not only did he also, retranslate it evidently, there's new interpretations, and he found 40 lines of text that were left out of the original publication, which definitely sounds intriguing. I want to take a look at that. So basically, I was more interested in sort of looking at the manuscript itself because there are very, I would say maybe well-known witches that have parts of Aradia woven into their teachings. And one is Raven Grimacy, who unfortunately is no longer alive, but he writes about the Strega, the Italian witches, and in the book I have, Italian Witchcraft, he mentions Aradia a lot. And so certainly that's very interesting, but my goal for this show is mostly looking at the text itself and commenting on it and sharing some thoughts about that. You could, otherwise it'd be too long as well, I would think. So anyway, before we get started on the actual what's in the book, I wanted to mention a little bit about Charles Leland. And I found a really nice bio, actually, in Raven Grimacy's Italian Witchcraft, which I wanted to read some of the bio. And this is a quote from the book. Charles Godfrey Leland was a famous folklorist who wrote several classic texts on English gypsies and Italian witches. He was born in Philadelphia on August 15th, 1824, and died in Florence, Italy on March 20th, 1903. Leland was fascinated by folklore and folk magic even as a child and went on to author such important works as Etruscan Roman Remains, Legends of Florence, The Gypsies, Gypsy Sorcery, and Aradia, Gospel of the Witches. And I believe he was even at one point adopted by one of the king of the gypsies. I think it was in England, but I'm not sure. And that's very unusual. So the thing you get about Charles Leland reading also in his appendix, he talks about some things in the end of the Gospel of the Aradia. Um, you get that he was really interested in all of this his whole life, and that he is very authentic. And there's definitely some debate about if this information is real or authentic or completely authentic, but it does seem to have parts of it that are authentic, and it does seem to have respect over the years. And certainly it deeply influenced witchcraft, modern witchcraft, and continues to today. So it's important for that reason. So the way the book came to be was that Leland had a 10-year friendship between him and a woman supposedly named Magdalena, and he calls her a semi-literate peasant woman born of an Italian witch family. And so the book itself is meant to be a representation of Italian witchcraft. Interesting enough, it did end up influencing British witchcraft because of Gardner. So it's had its influence everywhere, but just that as an aside. So whether or not was this woman real, it seems like she was. It seems like that, even Leyland, what Leyland in his book says, some of the gospel is not necessarily tied into the actual gospel. It's some aspect of magic or witchcraft that he thinks is important to talk about. So the book itself is, Leyland's book is 133 pages. And of that, the first 98 pages are actually the gospel part of Aradia, the Gospel of Witches, and the rest are interesting appendixes. So you should read that as well. And it's divided into 15 chapters. And the chapters are, it's more of a compilation book. It's not necessarily something chapter 1, 2, 3, that's coherent. There's different topics ranging from how Aradia came to be, to rituals, spells, and also creation stories of Diana. And in fact, Diana features more than Aradia in the book. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And the chapters, I'll give you some of the sample of the chapter titles so you can get a sense of it. The first two, you can see, once you read them, you can see where modern witchcraft, like Gardnerian witchcraft, was inspired by them. The first is how Diana gave birth to Aradia, also known as Herodias. And the second chapter is the Sabbat Tregwunda, or witch meeting. And then there's some other ones. I love some of the names of some of the chapters, such as the Charm of the Stones, the House of the Wind, and the Goblin Messengers of Diana and Mercury. So there are these sort of creation myths and sort of fables. And then there's also certain spells in there as well. There's some, I would say, common spells that people would use today. And so that you can see it's not necessarily kind of like a fluid in a sense, but they're all very interesting, all the different chapters. And the very first chapter, before we get going into sort of the first chapter, I did want to mention that in her book, Della Piana writes about Leland's translation. She was not really impressed by his translations, and she called them sloppy and sometimes completely off base. She says he ignores several passages and creates others. And she calls his work not so much as an translation, but an interpretation and opinion. And he doesn't offer a complete text in the original tongue so that we may discern whether the narrative portions of the book are even close to correctly translated. So she's not really impressed by the translation, though she does say that she thinks that there is enough truth in the book to make it plausible. And I think she's a practicing witch herself. So not too kind about his translation. And it probably is legitimate, and it is nice to see new translations of works in general. People can get nuances or different meanings out of it. So I think it's really good that people have taken the time to do that, actually. So going back to the actual book itself, the first chapter alone talks about how Aradia came to be. And I was going to read a little bit from that because it's really very nice. So there's some verses that are very poetic and beautiful in Leland's book. So chapter 1, it begins with Diana talking about that Diana had a daughter with her brother Lucifer, the god of the sun and the light. the god of the sun and the moon, the god of light, and they called her Aradia. And, quote, in those days there were on earth many rich and many poor. The rich made slaves of all the poor. In those days were many slaves who were cruelly treated, in every palace tortures, in every castle prisoners. Diana said one day to her daughter Aradia, it's true you are a spirit, but you were born to be also mortal, and you must go to earth and be a teacher to women and men who are willing to learn at your school, which will be composed of witchcraft. And Diana calls her daughter the foremost witch in the world. End of the quote. So that is really, I guess I hadn't really thought about the idea that Aradia is an avatar and like similar to Jesus, where you have this, she's born of this case, two gods, and she has this spirit body, but then she incarnates into the world and in order to teach witchcraft. And the other thing I learned that I didn't know from reading Charles Leland's book, because it's not in his book, but it's in, I guess Raven Grimacy talks about this in some other of his books, and also in Patricia Della Piana's book on Aradia, they talk about a real person named Aradia. But before I go into that part, there doesn't seem to be any clear goddess or deity associated with the name Aradia. One suggestion is from Della Piana, and she says that the name in its present form, there is a name Aradia, who was a Babylonian servant of Ea, the ferryman of the river Kubur, the river of death. And so that's one of the sort of issues is no one can really find a goddess or deity named Aradia. And then she also says a little bit later on that Aradia can be translated as the altar of the goddess. That's kind of neat. But this is the part I didn't know until I started doing research for the show is evidently there are several people or more than one person believe that Aradia was a real person born in Volterra, Italy on August 1313, quote, and this is again from Patricia's book, and did indeed teach the craft to all who wished to learn. She was hunted, tried, and burned at the stake during the Inquisition. However, legends tell us that she had left a manuscript of her teaching. In 1508, Bernardo Rattegno, an inquisitor in Italy, spoke of an expansion of witchcraft that had occurred 150 years earlier. This could be pointing to the time that Aradia was alive and teaching, end quote, again from Patricia's book on Aradia. So that was new to me, and I thought that was really fascinating. And as I said, somewhere in Raven Grimacy's books, he also sees her as a real teacher that came to Earth, and I guess the gospel is at least fragments of her teachings that she taught people. So you have, first of all, this idea that she's the offspring of a goddess or god, and then you have her as a real person that is actually martyred. And again, many religions have stories like this where they have a teacher descend into the world, whereas Buddha or Krishna, but she's one of the few female ones. So that's another reason why she's a very powerful figure, and this gospel is a very powerful book for women. But as I said earlier, when you actually look at the book itself, there's most of the worship is for Diana, her mother. And so I thought that was interesting, that the beginning it's about, Aradia, she's coming down to earth, and yet most of the rituals you're trying to call on Diana, or there's a story about how Diana created the stars and something else, I think. So, I guess in a way, the relationship, the mother-daughter relationship is very important. And there definitely is, I think, like Z Budapest group really honor, I think, Diana. And there's definitely women that will only follow sort of an all-woman's deity witchcraft or deity for witchcraft. There's definitely still groups that do that. And I can see why, because of the lack of it in other religions. And then there's the sort of magical or witchcraft groups that like to honor both the lady and the Lord, and sort of the combination of both. And though I seem to sort of lean in that direction, I do find myself often invoking powerful, singular female deities when I think about it, because Tara's like that too, even though Tara could be in relationship with Amitabha or something. So anyway, I could see that sort of the draw of still of Aradia. And the other thing that was I forgot to mention is that when I went to reread Aradia, I realized that she really was or is for the oppressed. And it's very clearly stated in there that they're going to help Diana and Aradia. They're going to help you if your feudal lord is taking advantage of you or torturing you or abusing you. And so uh, there's this movement, I think, a modern movement to connect Aradia to social justice. And what's interesting is that when I was practicing, throughout the years when I was practicing witchcraft, I met a woman who was a fairly well-to-do woman, and she made this comment that she thought that a lot of people involved in witchcraft didn't have a lot of money. And I thought about that even then. I said, well, that's because the witchcraft goddess is there to help people that are disenfranchised, and that they can call on her to help her with things like that. And so I think that I've always been kind of drawn more to the folk magic and more witches that are not as well known, because I was myself, I think Michael and I, we both really like the common man, and we want to feel that everyone has access to magic and everyone can do this. And I one of the reasons I didn't want to be formally involved with Buddhism is it's very hierarchical. Tibetan Buddhism is extremely hierarchical. And I do have an issue with that to some degree. I don't have an issue with teachers. That's a really good teacher is necessary in life, I feel, and can make your life really uh, just improve your life a lot. But that's different. A teacher is different from having like people that are spiritual leaders. And so when I was drawn to witchcraft, I liked that there was not necessarily a sort of pope figure or a priest, though unfortunately it still leans that direction in that you have people that are seen as sort of more witchy or more magical because they've published 12 books. And again, I'm not putting that down all of those people, but the idea of witchcraft that appealed to me was it was universal, and I could directly talk to the god or goddess or whoever, and I could sort of do my own magic either alone or in a group if I wanted to. I also liked the idea of the small group and the coven size, because small groups don't have as much abuse, though they certainly can have some. The larger a spiritual group gets, the more it can be corrupted by greed and power. And so that idea that you keep it small is helping with that power differential. And in fact, when we would do our group in Nova Scotia, we even would call the person leading the group the duty witch. That was their duty. There was no like title of high priest or high priestess. So I think we've mentioned this in other shows as well. So anyway, so that's a little bit about Aradia. Now I also did want to mention something I found in Raven Grimacy's Italian Witchcraft, which I really was affected by that book. I'm not Italian. My interest in Italy is probably through the tarot, even though, I mean, how could you not be interested in Italy? I'd love to go there, but I don't have it in my ancestry. I have Hungarian. I'm part Hungarian, but I love that book. And I did try some of the rituals. I found them really powerful. And in the book, I do remember, this is connected to Aradia a little bit. There was this ritual of setting up an ancestral shrine, and I did it, and it was to draw in what are called the lairs or lasas, sort of the protectors of your home. And I remember it was really powerful, and I did it based on the suggestion of Raven Grimacy. And then when I went back to read about this, he talked about Aradia's relationship to this concept. And he said that, again, he does say here that she said she lived in Tuscany and taught about Lhasa and the fire. And Grimacy says the flame became a symbol of the spirit of the old religion, which I didn't know that actually. And, quote, he says, Aradia associated the light of fire with personal enlightenment. She taught that we all bear a spark or flame of divine consciousness within us. This was our spirit or soul, and it's called the spirit flame. And I somehow had forgotten that. And I love that flame concept because unconsciously I see the image of fire and flame, and maybe not so. I'm conscious about it now, but it's becoming a theme this year. It started off with looking at the year of the wooden snake and how snake can be connected to alchemy with fire, and then just interesting enough, Michael and I recently joined the Unitarian Universalism, and their center symbol is a flame in a chalice. So I think this is a really interesting idea. And I know the flame is used by many traditions, but I didn't really know it was called something kind of so special, the spirit flame. So I really like that. And the other thing I realized as I was doing this show is I have mentioned this several times, sometimes with Jackie Smith, that I'm a little unhappy myself with the popular witchcraft movement, and I couldn't figure out what was bothering me. And I realized when I came across this part in his book, Grimacy's book, about the gifts of Aradia, I realized what was missing for me and what drew me into witchcraft. So he says that Aradia taught that the traditional powers of a witch would belong to anyone who followed the ways of the old religion, and that these gifts were not to be sought out directly. They were basically given to you because you were following the old ways. And I know in our time, in the 90s, most people were drawn to witchcraft in different ways because of the desire to connect with nature, to follow whatever the tradition of the old ways was according to their lineage. And it seems to me at least what's portrayed in modern witchcraft, it's not really as important. And that really saddened me. It saddened me a little bit. So it saddens me a lot actually, because it's becoming a little more about power and materialism. And so again, this is how things are portrayed in the popular witchcraft. I know there are plenty of people practicing the old ways right now, every day, and they've been doing it quietly and sometimes publicly. So I was very grateful that I decided to do this show because it really brought an understanding to me that made me feel more sort of whole again, that's why I follow this path, and I will continue to because of my love of nature and of also working with the cycles of nature, and being more in harmony with nature. So everything around that for me is important. I was going to mention what the gifts are, but we really don't have time. And I wanted to quickly share a spell that I found in this great little book I have, Potions and Spells of Witchcraft. Basically, it's a spell for casting out loneliness, and it's based on laughter, recording laughter. And in this case, I was going to read the whole thing, but basically, this witch recorded laughter of all kinds of different people, and then she replayed it in front of her coven, which kind of touched them when the witch then said that she was very lonely. And then after that, even they all had a good laugh together, and she made friends with them. So the idea of laughter being healing and bringing us together. And I think we could all sometimes use a very good laugh right now. I know for me, it can be a very sober time, but laughing can also relieve loneliness and help us feel connected. So that's my spell for the day. Record your laughter and others and listen to it and see if that might help bring you together with your friends or just laugh with each other. So I hope you are inspired to read Aradia, The Gospel of Witches yourself. I would say start with Charles Leland's book. It's very important, but go on to the other translations as well. So thank you for listening in. Join us next time as we continue to explore the esoteric and the obscure together. Have a great week.